Here is the bracket. This is the bracket right here. And so what you have are the 4 seeds, and Boise State now would be among the top-rated conference champions. The top 5 conference champions, of course, get in the playoff. BYU's a part of it, but now no longer a bye. Boise State has moved into the conversation. The BYU lost guys to Kansas opened this up. We kind of thought that it might happen. Doesn't mean it's official, but man, do they have work to do.
Well, they don't care for BYU, clearly in their resume, even though they beat SMU. But they don't really care for SMU all that much either, when it comes to some of these other ones. And you could argue SMU's had a better season so far than Miami, but Miami has, the hot quarterback in Cam Ward. So those things can be inferred by this. I don't have, and look, I don't envy them trying to figure out, a bunch of 2-loss teams in the SEC and how to weight that. But I do think that we're seeing, you reap what you sow. You make these conferences this big, you don't have as many common opponents, or you trade off losing to equally good teams. This is what you get. So, I mean, outside of, I think, SMU and BYU being ranked a little too low, I don't really have a huge problem with this one.
I think something that's dawned on me is, so many people were against the expanded playoff idea in general. I don't know that it was a majority, but there were definitely a lot of people that were not in favor of that. And I think the thing to have been more worried about was not the expanded playoff, but the expanded conferences. That's what's throwing so much of a monkey wrench into a lot of this process because, yes, it's become all jumbled with far fewer ways to compare because there's fewer head-to-heads and there's a lot more teams to account for, and it spreads the schedule thin in some cases. So if anything's done a number on the regular season for people that feel it's been tainted in some way, it's the conference realignment piece more than it is the 12-team playoff piece. Would y'all agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, when we hear about let's get to 20 teams and 22 teams, I just don't know how that's sustainable. I don't know how that would be good for anybody not named the SEC or the Big Ten based on what we've seen just through this part of it. But who knows where we're headed. Maybe it continues to grow, as far as conference sizes. Maybe it retracts in some way. But I definitely feel like that's the biggest issue with doing a lot of these comparisons. If you're Boise State, you feel great. Win out, and you are in the field, and you are looking like you're going to get a bye, which would be pretty incredible, and certainly the easiest way to find yourself into the next round of the playoffs, because otherwise in other scenarios you're going to Ohio State or something. So if you could somehow get a bye, then that gets you into that next round, which would be absolutely massive. Tennessee and the SEC and Georgia and Alabama and where everybody falls. You got A&M that's still involved there. That's a mess, but I can see why Tennessee fans are so vocal, because there is a very real chance that they get left out of this thing. So we're only going to hear more of that being and moaning over the next couple of weeks most likely. And then the whole BYU thing, I feel like they obviously deserve to drop with the loss. I feel like the drop was pretty severe, though. For a game that was pretty tight, I understand that people just look at Kansas's record, but I think when you hear a lot of people talk about that Kansas loss, yes, they are what their record says they are, but it's very easy to see who does not pay attention to what Kansas is actually doing when they talk about Kansas, and they just look at the record and assume Kansas sucks because they're 4-6, and it's have you watched them at all in the last month? I don't think that you have. Now that
isn't that what they're supposed to be doing?
Yes, but I think it's very clear when you watch certain things that they don't watch everything. I think that's been very clear in a lot of cases, a lot of shows, a lot of whatever. And you can't. It's hard to watch every single little bitty thing, but in the case of you wanting to tear down BYU for Kansas, at least have some idea of what you're talking about when it comes to Kansas, and don't just spout their record, because that's not the argument. But still, don't lose to Kansas at home, and BYU is in the top 4. And I know that's easier said than done, but folks, especially Big 12 fans, I'm sorry to say it, but you're not just going to earn respect by just asking for it over and over again.
Absolutely.
You get it by going and taking it. And so, yes, BYU got dinged hard for the one loss. Yes, they probably got dinged harder than other teams in different leagues are getting dinged for their one loss. Yes, their one loss might count the same as other teams' 2 losses. But you know what? The game is rigged to some extent. And knowing that, you have to be perfect to ensure that you get what you want at the end. So they don't have to be perfect. They can just win out, and they will be in the college football playoff. And maybe chaos happens, and they get to jump up back into the bye part of it. But they do have to be very leery, as does the Big 12 as a whole, because you can see the scenario setting up where if they keep eating each other week to week, then there's a realistic scenario where you are barely hanging on with one team in the playoff, and so it's a little bit of a torn feeling. I like the entertaining regular season, but I also know it leads to maybe not the most successful postseason. So it's a weird time to be a fan of the Big 12.
Alabama was number 1 when they lost to Vanderbilt and dropped to 7. And then they, I think, won another game. Then they lost to Tennessee and dropped, or they got moved back up. Then they dropped to 7. But when they did lose to Missouri, they dropped to 15. So there is history of other teams that have lost, and even though we might think, well, that some teams are protected, they dropped to 15 when they lost that game to Tennessee after losing to Vanderbilt a couple of weeks prior to that. So the teams on the bubble, you mentioned SMU, they're undefeated inside the conference. Their one loss is to BYU, who is right behind them. We see when head-to-head matters, and we also then see, I don't want to say hypocritical, but we also see when head-to-head doesn't matter if they don't want it to matter. A&M is 15. They've just kind of stayed there. They have their chance if they want to get some things done. And then after that, quite frankly, we ought to see how things play out. Army, unbeaten, will have Notre Dame this weekend. They're at number 19.
Well, and that's Army's shot. Like, if Army doesn't win that game, then they have all they need to say, well,
there's a lot of this playoff conversation this week, and I'm one that I've started to retract a bit from social media more, and so I just avoid a lot of the noise surrounding this because it can sometimes, I don't know about y'all, take away my enjoyment of it. Like watching last night, just getting caught up in all of the back and forth trash throwing, and I just kind of want to sit and look at the bracket a little bit.
Yeah,
and especially when I find myself not really enjoying the whole argument about, well, if this and this and this and this, and it's like, okay, yeah, if all that happens, that would turn out that way. But, y'all are putting a lot of weight on Army upsetting Notre Dame this weekend. A lot of weight on that. And so if it happens, yeah, a whole lot of, a dam is going to burst. But there's a very real chance that it doesn't. So, can we just let that kind of – I know that's not how it works, and speculation's part of the fun of it all. But there's so much of it that it kind of is it does – why do we play the games almost? You know what I mean? But, yeah, the Army game this weekend is going to have a huge bearing. And if folks are right and they pull this upset, then this is going to, turn this thing on its head, and that would be amazing. But I'm not also banking on that being the case this weekend. So a lot of football still left to be played. But, it's cool to see this all kind of taking shape.
Everybody has their own opinion about what we saw last night. Again, it's still not over. There are still games to be played this weekend, the next, in the conference championship weekend. Nicole Arbach of NBC Sports wrote a long column about this. But in the column, the part that really stands out here, this is part of a quote from her article. I am sick and tired of the idea that the SEC's 2-loss merry-go-round of teams are inherently better than the Hoosiers or Penn State or Miami or anyone else for that matter, simply because they'd be favored against them in a hypothetical matchup. What did Tom Fornelli discuss or put up on his Twitter feed that we discussed yesterday?
Same thing. Everybody, it's supposed to be about on the field, but everybody's doing this hypothetically. And you have a lot of, especially SEC talking heads that are like, you can't tell me that Indiana would beat Georgia. No, I can't tell you that Georgia would beat Indiana either.
What was the favorite? How much of a spread was Vanderbilt, Alabama?
Well, in this,
there you go.
She says 22.5.
22.5 points.
So,
yeah,
there's a lot of that, why do we even play that's kind of what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
Of this team would beat so-and-so, and it's you didn't beat Kentucky. How are you telling me you're just going to automatically go and beat, BYU or whoever? There's this adamant, the dogs, I don't want to say, actually the Georgia comparison, I'm tired of using that one, the cliche, the stereotype, but I think it was a Tennessee fan or Ole Miss fan or something. Yeah, I think it was an Ole Miss fan. It's Ole Miss would roll any team not named Oregon, Ohio State. And it's you mean they rolled Kentucky? Oh, wait. That didn't happen because they lined up on the field and played the game, and as it turns out, the favorite doesn't always win, guys. Isn't that amazing? The favorite doesn't always win. Instead of us it's almost like people want to, people in a certain part of the country want to do the dynasty mode on this thing where you play 20 years and you just fast forward through the regular season, you just hit the button and then it puts you in the playoff and you just go from there and you actually play the games. That's what I think some people would like, and they want it all to be based off this bias of, well, all of our teams are superior to everyone else, and our losses don't mean as much in all this, and it's just created a weird kind of I don't know how else to put it, but a Southeastern circle jerk. I mean, I think that's what the C stands for sometimes, because there's just this whole that would be automatic. It's like, you didn't beat Kentucky. I mean, so I think a lot of people are kind of getting tired of that. I also think SEC fans have the ones that are being real about it and not just going, well, we'd win because of the logo, but the ones are saying like, no, really though, I think we have like 5 of the 7 best teams. I think they have a valid point.
I agree.
I think that point gets watered down though when you try to start shoving like team 8 and 9 and then pretending like with 2 or 3 losses they're the equivalent of somebody else's 1 loss. I think that's where you lose the plot and your argument as an SEC fan. But if you want to say, like 5 of the 7 are the best teams in the country, I think you're probably right. But that's not how it works. So you got to go out there and actually do it on the field.
Well, the argument would be we're supposed to find the 12 best teams, and if that means all of them are from the SEC, then that's – but
well, there's the problem.
Here's another one.
I say –
retired stockbroker, someone – who did Vanderbilt lose to? Georgia State. UT Parking. Ironically, by citing Vanderbilt's upset over Bama, she inadvertently highlighted the depth of the SEC. Well, then also Kansas beating BYU. Does that mean that the Big 12 is deep? I don't know if they're deep.
Okay, Arizona State beat Mississippi State. I know Mississippi State's not a contender, but we can do this all day.
We can do this all day, and part of the problem is this is much like the top 25 wins. It's which argument do you want to use that best suits what your argument is supposed to be. I think there's just it's a mess, and you can do that all day long of. Well, so-and-so beat so-and-so beat so-and-so, and you can do that whole property thing down the line. But, I lost my thought there.
No, but, again, you can do it all the way down the line. But I think, Craig, before you were about to say, look, you may have the best team, but you also still have to earn it, right? I mean, you may have the most talent. You may have to do this. But if you lose 3 games, you didn't earn it, did you?
Oh, no. I was thinking of the fact that you have the conversation about it's like, oh my gosh, it keeps escaping me. I'm sorry. I lost my point.
Retired stockbroker was saying, well, somebody lost to Vandy. Yes, it was Alabama. Somebody earlier, right before you, I'm sorry I misquoted you. Well, who did Vanderbilt lose to? Georgia State. Everybody, there's no perfect team this year. There are how many undefeated teams this year? So if you want to paint a certain picture, you can by just jumbling up a lot of they're deeper. They're deeper top to bottom. And again, it all goes down to this, though. Decide who's going to play based on what happens on the field, and don't put somebody ahead of somebody else based on, well, Vegas would have been favored by 20 because Vanderbilt was a 22.5-point underdog, too. All right, the BCS, remember that? They put that together after Michigan and Nebraska split the 97 national title. Craig, if it comes back to you, let me know. Here is the simulated BCS based on where we are today compared to the college football playoff. And really, the difference, you have the 4th seed is BYU, not Boise State. So that also affects the second round in the college football playoff. But for the most part, everything is pretty much the same. It's not much of a difference from the computer model compared to what they do with the College Football Playoff Committee. And by the way, the computer model still used human rankings as a part of what they would do to get to their BCS championship.
So, I've often said I would like to see them use the BCS to maybe get to a certain point and then rotate it from there based on some other things. So if they do that, that's great, especially if it comes out this way. I think that they should use a variance of different things because, I'm really not a fan of the eyeball test because that's in the eye of the beholder. And I think you need to have the eyeball test needs to be for maybe seeding.
Dude, the eyeball test says that Ole Miss would beat everybody not named Ohio State and Oregon, according to some people's eyeballs.
Exactly.
So,
So the eyeball test needs to maybe be for seeding, once you get to your 12. But the 12 should have, record needs to matter. It needs to matter. It really does.
Really? You mean wins and losses?
Yes.
Yeah, no.
It has to matter.
That's why the NFL model, which is not what they do now in college, but a lot of things are, you have wins and losses. If you're 10-7 and the team in your division is 9-8, you win the division. And you also then get something because you won the division, but that is with the NFL. Now let's look at Miami, Boise State, SMU, and BYU. Comparisons from Tom Fornelli. Miami's strength of schedule is 54th, Boise State 76th, SMU is 86th, BYU is 53rd. Barely ahead of Miami by one nut. Strength of record, Miami 9th, Boise State is 15th, SMU is 14th, all very good. BYU is 8th, yet again ahead of all of them, including Miami. 9th is that game control, or the next one's game control. Look at the numbers, all very similar. They're very, very similar resumes in certain ways, and yet BYU, when it comes to game control, which I don't even like that particular term, but it's there, is also ahead of everybody on that list. So you can make anything look the way you want. People have beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but bottom line is wins and losses. Oh, by the way, BYU, you lost. You lost at home. You've been playing with fire. You've also won some great games, but you lost at home, and that allowed this to open up to what it is today.
Yeah, and I don't fault anybody who says, based on the eye test, that they don't think BYU's like the top 4, in the country. I know that now they've knocked themselves out of that bye with the loss last week, but I see a lot of the complaining about the fall last night. And I do think it was a pretty drastic fall. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I do think the point I was trying to make earlier about like top 25 wins, it's like you count them the way that you want to count them, and I still don't have my full point yet back in my head. But with BYU, it's like, yeah, you won the games, but there's also something to that eye test of I watched them, and I don't think that they're one of the best 4 teams in the country. And I didn't think they were necessarily head and shoulders above a lot of the rest of the Big 12. So we'll see how it comes home to roost. Ultimately, if they're the Big 12 champ, they'll be in and all of that. But I'm not surprised that people saw them get dinged and then dinged them accordingly because they didn't really believe in them to begin with. But having them behind SMU is certainly a questionable type of decision. I think SMU's a great story, and we'll have something to say about this ultimately as well. And they can go win the ACC. But that was a big win for BYU. Their resume speaks for itself, but I do think they're getting knocked by the eye test and perception as much as anything.
Yeah, and Colorado is there, but they have work to do. And, of course, they have this weekend Kansas, who they play. And then, of course, they had the nice win. They've been on this nice run, but they have work to do too. So you would think right now maybe they can climb up high enough if they get to the Big 12 title game and win because of that 5 conference champions, the highest ranked. But they've got work to do as well. What?
Can we just look at the bracket and just look at it in the games rather than just for a second look at the actual games themselves and talk about those? Because I know they're not going to be the final set, but just the idea of, like, these are the matchups we're going to get is pretty damn fun, even though it'll change here in the last couple of weeks. Now, BYU at Ohio State, I don't know how fun that would be. I think that would be one where the Cougs better bring their A game. But, I mean, traveling into Columbus and playing Ohio State for a shot to go play Boise, I think both teams would feel pretty salty about their chance to, maybe go get a win in the next round. All due respect to Boise. But that would be a neutral site bowl game, so it's not like you'd be in the all-blue field and all of that. But, yeah, BYU going to Columbus would be something else. Alabama, Notre Dame, and South Bend. Georgia, Penn State, and Happy Valley.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure they do a whiteout for that if that's a night game. And then Ole Miss, Indiana, which is not anything that anybody other than Indiana fans would have predicted or hoped for prior to the season, but it does have an element of intrigue to it. And you know what? It sets up for the SEC or whoever in these things wants to, pound their chest like, hey, if Alabama won and Georgia won and Ole Miss won, then you got 4 of the 6 teams in the semis and brag all you want to, but at least you'd earned your way there as opposed to just being placed there. But it's also kind of weird to see 1, 2, 3, 4 teams and complain about not having 5 or 6. It's just wild. And you play one less conference game, and you got teams like Alabama playing Mercer right now, and they're arguing about like they're like being treated like just slaves or something. It's just crazy to me. The completely made up and fabricated disrespect card that we're seeing over these last couple of weeks, but they can go shut up everybody, and they could have half the, if not more than half the field in the next round. But yeah, those first 4 round matchups are super intriguing, and I think they'd set up for some pretty juicy matchups in the next round. And I would not be surprised if the Final Four was as close as it possibly can be to all SEC 3 out of the 4 is all you could manage. But, yeah, that wouldn't be shocking and, then thump your chest.
So,
by the way, Alabama moved up one after beating Mercer.
Yeah, not only do you play one less conference game, which, okay, if you want to make that argument, that also is a very much a narrative of like, well, the schedule's so tough that we play one less game. We know it's because you don't have the TV money you want. That's the only reason why. So you already do that. But then on top of that, all these bowl-eligible teams that get their 6th win by beating some team in Week 14 that has no business playing these teams at this time of year. That's just part of the argument that we just – I know people do settle on that, but it's just – the propaganda is just wild, y'all. Like, the football's legit.
Crazy.
The football's legit. The football's legit. It's the best conference in America. I wouldn't be surprised if they had 3 of the 4 semifinals, but the propaganda we get is just crazy.
Yeah, it is. And my bigger problem isn't the SEC teams that could get in, because just by virtue of being the SEC, you're going to have a better schedule this year than Penn State did. And Penn State, and maybe even Indiana. So, if Penn State and Indiana both lose to Ohio State, now, Indiana can change the narrative completely. They beat Ohio State. They're in the Big Ten championship game and playing Oregon, and then we'll see what happens. But so Penn State has 1 loss. BYU has 1 loss, and they're the 12th seed because they're in the Big 12 compared to the Big 10. But if you look at the strength, BYU's strength of schedule is better than Penn State's.
Oh, yeah.
And they have the same record. SMU's strength of schedule is better than Penn State's, and they have the same record. So if you're going to leave 1-loss teams out, why is Penn State? Why? Just because of the strength of their loss? That's dumb.
Yeah.
That's really dumb.
And there's just not as much of a crowd chanting Big Ten, so they don't get focused on as much. They kind of don't put themselves in that conversation. I mean, I see some Big Ten fans that are talking about how Penn State's still better than BYU or whoever, but it's just not as loud on social media, at least, that I see. So I do think sometimes the SEC can probably unfairly get targeted because other leagues are doing the same thing or have the same arguments. But I just think it goes so overboard eventually where it's like, yeah, why do we even have a season? That's when it turns into silliness. Whereas, yeah, there's a totally valid way to pick apart the Big Ten's argument of the teams that they've got in this thing right now. But I do think in their case, it's going to get cleaned up here, starting this weekend. I think the SEC, some of that will get cleaned up as well, which is why the whole wringing of hands and pulling of hair week to week is always a little bit over the top because it's going to continue to get settled. Now, it's not going to fully prevent a logjam because everybody's run down the scenarios where this thing's a total cluster in the SEC in particular at the end of the year because of the bigger conference. But I do think some of these issues could get resolved here as soon as Saturday. So that'll clean up some of this mess.
All right, so the chat room going at it. I sometimes, when I see somebody on the chat room make a comment, I don't know if you're discussing what we're saying. So when you do that, it's kind of it helps us. Are you talking about somebody else, what they said in the chat? If you do have it for us to discuss or something we said that you would like to correct us with, then say, hey, guys, or Smokey, Paul, Craig, whatever that you want. Roll Tide. Guys, Kentucky has some real dudes on that line, and when they show up, it shows. Seems like y'all didn't know that. They're 4-6. Their wins are, and they do have a win against Ole Miss, Ohio, Southern Miss, and Murray State. Now, they also had to play like Georgia and Alabama, so they've had to play whoever it was. But their wins, let me go over again. Ohio, Southern Miss, Murray State, and yes, they had the nice win against Ole Miss. Stoops has had a couple of teams that would get you and could get you. This team here seems to be struggling. Texas has them next on Saturday in Austin.
I think Kentucky's a good 4-6 team, but they're probably not making a bowl game. So this is wherein lies the problem of giving a lot of credit for not having actually accomplished anything. So that win over Ole Miss is carrying all the weight for Kentucky right now. Yeah. And so I understand what you're trying to say, but this is kind of what we're talking about of losses don't mean anything because you're in the SEC. So your 4 don't mean the same as somebody else's 7 or something. And that's where we lose the plot here because winning does have to matter. So this whole, Kentucky's not your typical 4-loss. Well, we can just apply that across the board, and that's what happens. And so then none of it means what it's supposed to mean in comparison to what it means for everybody else. And that's where it just becomes silly because you're arguing that a loss to a 4-loss team isn't quite what it is, but I guarantee you're not making that argument for anybody else that would lose to a 4-loss team if they were in another league.
Yeah, and I think that the two things that the Power 2, the Super 2 have done, the Big Ten convinced everybody that we're great football and We just have so many alums. Well, there's a lot of us. So you gotta, we have a lot. But if you look at, who really is competing in the Big Ten, it's been Ohio State and then like a rando, like popping up occasionally like a gopher. And the SEC, what the SEC convinced everybody was that the middle of their league is better than the middle of all the other leagues. And that's not true. I
don't think it's true every year.
No, but it's not true every year. Yeah, sometimes it is, but it's not true every year. But they've convinced everybody that it's true in perpetuity. That no matter what happens, no matter what the schedule says, no matter what the wins and losses says, the middle of the SEC is better than the middle of every other conference.
No, not the middle.
Oh,
the middle of the SEC is as good as a lot of the tops of other conferences.
Yeah, okay, yeah, exactly. So that like the middle of the SEC is better. No, it's the middle. It's the middle. The bottom is the bottom. That's the same.
Okay, we got a couple of other things. Craig, finish it up. We got to get 2 or 3 more things. Taylor McCarg will help also give his opinion on this at 3:40.
Yeah, no, to the Kentucky fan, I appreciate you listening. I definitely understand the standpoint or the viewpoint you're trying to take. But, I mean, we can look at 4-loss teams. Well, Kansas is not your typical 4-loss team. If you look at their schedule and you look at the way that they've lost games, so that BYU loss shouldn't hurt as bad as it did, right? But they don't have that same perception because they're in the Big 12. So, therefore, win season isn't the same as Kentucky's 4-win season because Kentucky's played, so and so and so. And that's where, like, these comparisons are never fair because there's this built-in, never-changing idea in the minds of some that no matter the year, they are always the best every time, no matter what, top to bottom, better than everybody's best, right? That's part of, like, the brain waves now at this point. And it's just simply not true every single year. But that's the bias now that's in this. Every time you try to make, this is better than this. And it's like, I just don't think that's the case every year. And I think that's what kind of muddies the waters and people's brains when it comes to being open to consider that, hey, BYU, they lost to a 4-win team, but Kansas is actually much better than their record indicates. And so, again, we can go in circles and circles and compare the records. I'm glad these next couple weeks will clear some of this up. But certainly, going back to the very beginning of the show, realignment has wreaked more havoc on this whole conversation than the actual expanded playoff did.
Okay, no question. Here's the thing about also Kentucky. I don't know how many teams in the country had Georgia and Tennessee and Ole Miss on their schedule if they'd win those games. I think that's absolutely in defense of them being 4-6, but they also have lost to Florida and Auburn, who we all know has struggled themselves. Here's a quote from Ward Manuel. Garrett, is that good? Ward Manuel, when asked about Texas and Georgia. Georgia, of course, has the 15-point win on the road against UT. When he was asked about Texas being above Georgia, as the committee analyzed the body of work of Texas versus where Georgia is at the present time with 2 losses, even to top 25 teams, we came out that Texas was still very strong, a deserving number 3 seed. Talking about body of work, and this is not against Texas because I think they're really, really good. What is their body of work? There's an example of using body of work with them when, if you compare it to what and who they've actually played, not their fault, but what is the body of work? What is Penn State's body of work? Or maybe other teams, I'm just using that. That's a Ward Manual.
Indiana.
Yeah, Indiana. Indiana's body of work. Indiana gets hit for their body of work, but other schools don't. And it seemed like, and maybe I'm wrong, 90% of the time, the body of work that goes in favor of somebody is also because of the name on their damn jersey.
I disagree because I think Indiana's a terrible example. I think Indiana's getting every benefit. They're number 5 in the country. So their body of work's not dinging them at all. It's that people want the body of work to ding them, and it's not. That's what's frustrating, especially if you're probably an SEC fan and all you hear is people complaining about the SEC's complaining. And the Big Ten has their own warts when you look at this, like a Penn State, and how strong are they really? How strong is Indiana really? Now, again, the great thing about this is all of this overreaction the day after Tuesday this time of year. Well, guess what? Ohio State plays Indiana. So that's going to get cleared up. And they're either going to be an 11-0, and you can say, well, they didn't play. Well, they beat Ohio State. So shut the blank up because they will have proven that at that point. Or they're going to lose to Ohio State and just confirm that maybe they were a little bit more of a paper tiger like some people seem to think. I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. I think they're a very good team. But, yeah, they have their own teams that have, because of realignment, not necessarily played a tough schedule, and that's where, if you're an SEC fan, you do have some arguments. It's just that it doesn't apply to every single team all the time. That's where it drives me crazy. Is it like everybody gets this benefit of the doubt as though they're like Georgia or something, and that's what's insane. But no, it's not fair across the board. And yeah, the Big Ten, you can make some cases that they are wildly overranked. Because eye test says that Indiana's not the 5th best team in the country, and if they were in the SEC and had to play so-and-so and so-and-so, they'd have 2 or 3 losses. So that's why we just continue this merry-go-round, and hopefully the games actually settle most of this.
The things of body of work, game control, close losses, all of that is like mixed into a bag like a lottery ball or coming out of a ping pong ball, coming out of the machine. And let's use this one this week, or let's use this one for this group of teams and others. Here's one more note. Tennessee, they now, and I've said this before, the SEC protects its own better than any conference in America, even with the newcomers of Oklahoma and Texas, and both with big boy names and also traditions. However, there's going to be some SEC eating its own here pretty soon because they're going to have to scratch and claw to try to get in. From Ross Dellinger, the Vols need some of this to happen.
I think they need all of it, right?
Need one of these to happen.
Okay.
Auburn beats A&M this weekend. A&M beats Texas. Minnesota over Penn State. Ohio State blows out Indiana. Oklahoma over Alabama in Norman this weekend. Florida beats Ole Miss. Georgia Tech over Georgia. And Army or USC beat Notre Dame. That's not like, well, that can't happen. A lot of those things might happen. Not sure if they will, but they do need a little bit of help, it appears, based on when everything comes to a head after the conference championship weekend. Also, one of the other things that talked about, close losses, BYU, close wins. You win the game, and then you have a close loss. And they can pick apart that. And you know what's great? And I think UT Parking, you brought this up. I thought going to 12 teams would make it easier and less. No, it's made it worse because now more teams are involved.
That's fine. I'd much rather have an argument about who number 12 is and how many teams leagues deserve than saying the 5th team who lost one game doesn't deserve a shot at the national title. I'd much rather do this. I don't care. I'd much rather put up with all the egos and the weird tribalism that comes with college football, and I say weird in a loving way. Sometimes maybe not, but I'd rather have all that and, have the SEC or the Big Ten or whoever, barking about their need for a 4th, 5th, 6th team. I'd rather just shut off Twitter and not have to hear half that than sit there and actually watch the committee tell me why this 5th place team doesn't deserve a crack at the national title because of whatever superfluous reason. I think I'd rather have this chaos because I think it's way more interesting. I think just the 14, it just wasn't enough. For me, as a college football, it just wasn't enough. And to have all of these teams involved, I think is great because let's say Tennessee does get in, for example, because like some chaos happens or something, and they go run the table. Well, they wouldn't have got in the last go-round. And they might be the best team in the country, but because it's such a select field, you didn't get the crack at it. Because I do think teams get better. And that just because you weren't unbeaten doesn't mean you're not the best team in the country at the end of the year. Or because maybe even in some cases you had 2 losses doesn't mean you're not the best team in the country. Because I can see a scenario where you get the draw of like a bye and then you play Boise where people will try to knock the playoff run potentially. But between the semifinals and the championship game, there's not really going to be much of an argument to say this team is not legitimate, no matter how many regular season losses they may have had, because you're going to have to go through a hell of a ride no matter what draw you get. So if that means that it was the 5th place team in the SEC, hey, they got their crack and they took advantage of it, but in previous years, they would have had no chance. So that's why I much prefer this.
No, I do. I love it. I do think that we've kind of had lost steam on some weekends being better than others, and that's based on how the schedule is set up. I do think that the fact that not everybody plays everybody, which is never going to happen again, it appears, does leave some loopholes or room for argument.
But again, that's realignment's fault. That's not the playoffs' fault. If everybody was back in their own leagues, then there'd be a lot less of this. Well, they didn't play so-and-so and play so-and-so and play so-and-so. Well, yeah, it wouldn't have happened because most of these teams would have still been playing each other, and the instances where they weren't would have been far fewer in between. Now, it's just commonplace that, like, Team A doesn't play the Texas example of They haven't played like 3 of the top 4 teams or whatever the note was.
Of the teams involved in trying to get to the SEC championship, they have not yet played any of those teams.
Yeah, so prime example.
It's not their fault.
But no, it's not. That's what I'm saying is that the expansion did that, though. And so if they were in the Big 12 or if they were in the a different SEC, they wouldn't have had nearly as many instances of that. So realignment did the number on this conversation more than just having 8 more playoff spots did, in my opinion, at least.